I hope everybody had a great Labor Day weekend. I got froggy and decided to try cooking a thing called a beef brisket. And I'm sorry to tell you that we ended up going to Bojangles and getting fried chicken. My dog wouldn't even eat it. So I'm going to have to work on that and maybe learn more about how to do all that. But anyway, thank all of you for joining us. We're glad to have you with us today. And we're going to ask if Bill Carslake will open with an invocation. Bill?
Let us pray. God of all, today we pray that we may receive your blessings because we are committed to be a service organization to help mankind. May each of us in our daily routine come to know the joy of caring and sharing with others who are not as fortunate as we are. May our motto that includes serving, caring, and sharing be with us for life service, not just lip service. Amen.
Thank you, Bill. And now, David, can you bring up the flag for us?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Would you please join me with the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty
and justice for all.
Thank you, Dave.
Julie Becker.
Okay. And now for our program, the title is View from the Tower, A Survivor's Story. It'll be presented by Greg Trevor, hope I pronounced that right, and he will be introduced by David Hawk. David, would you please introduce our guest speaker?
Okay, wonderful to have Greg. Greg and I met in 1989 in Gastonia, and I had just gotten out of school, and Greg, I think, had just gotten out. A bunch of us guys that kind of met in Gastonia that had just gotten out of school. So I was with the Rangers. That team eventually became the Crawdads. But Greg was working for the Charlotte Observer in the Gaston Observer office. And you guys remember the days of the Catawba Valley Neighbors, I'm sure. So I didn't know anybody down there. So the writers became my friends. I met sports writers, and really those are the group of folks I hung out with, and just a great group of guys. And they all went on to, a lot of them went on to be award-winning journalists like Greg is. But in '93, we left, and I think those guys all kind of spread out. So I didn't know where Greg was. And that's what you do. You move on. Everybody moves on. And I have the paper here. I remember that it was a Saturday morning, April 27, 2002. I've kept it, Greg.
Oh, great.
It was so moving. But anyway, the morning of Saturday, April 27th, 2002, I do what I normally do when I get the paper. Read the sports first, read the front page second, and then maybe go to the Carolina Living or local section third. So I'm just reading stories of September 11th. And even in North Carolina, so many of us were affected by September 11th. We knew people. There was a young girl not far behind me in class, Sandra Teague. You may remember her name. She passed. She was in the plane that went into the Pentagon. Sandra was from Granite. And then my wife's had a classmate from high school that was in one of the towers that passed. So any of those human interest stories I would read. So I picked up the paper, and probably just God was with us that day. That was the title. And I just started reading. I didn't look at the editor's note. I didn't look at the author. I just started reading. I got into it a little bit, and it said, how did it say here? I've got it. Oh, he gives his name. It says, I picked up the phone, Greg Trevor here. So I remember I shouted, Greg Trevor. And my wife said, who's Greg Trevor? I said, Greg wrote this article. Oh my gosh, he was in He was in the Tower One. So I read through and I look at the picture, and Greg will remember this. Greg, remember?
Yes.
Yeah. So I look at look to see that that's Greg, and wow, it's Greg. It says, after September 11th, family means more to the Trevors: Allison, Gabriel, Greg, and Lucas. So I'm looking at the picture, and he's got on a Hickory Crawdads hat. If you can see that, Hickory Crawdads. And I'm like, oh my gosh, Greg's got on a Hickory Crawdads hat. So read that article, and it's, he's a wonderful writer, and it's just a incredible story, which he'll tell you here in a second. So that was a Saturday. I don't know. It was just, I couldn't let it go. I couldn't sleep. I just had this feeling I've got to talk to him. So sometime that week, a few days after that week, I just called up to the Port Authority, and he took my call, and we chatted, and it was good to catch up with him. Mm-hmm. And I said, if you come to North Carolina, let's hook up. So that rascal that summer came to Hickory and came to a Crawdads game. And Greg, you can explain to him here in a second about the Crawdads hat.
Yep. Well, I had covered, you want me to do it now or do you want to wait?
Yeah, go ahead. That's fine.
Okay. Yeah, I had covered the return of the Crawdads. Well, actually, I should back it up a little bit. Before I worked in Gastonia, I worked in Hickory, and I don't know if I'm trying to look at the photos of everyone to see if there's anybody who might remember me from when I was there. I was in Hickory from '86 to '88, and one of the things I had written about when I was a reporter there was our old friend George Murphy trying to bring minor league baseball back to Hickory, and so I had covered that a lot. Went with him to some of the Sally League meetings. Met some of the leadership in the league, and then in '94, when the first game was played at the new stadium, which is a beautiful ballpark, I love that ballpark. I was working in Raleigh by then, and in fact was about to leave to go to Pennsylvania because my wife had gotten a job up there, and went back for opening day, and so I always had fond memories of there. And that day, opening day in '94, I bought that hat, and I used to wear that hat all the time. And I remember we were living in Allentown, Pennsylvania after that, and we went into a restaurant that was within walking distance of where we were living. And there was I think the bartender was wearing a Hickory Crawdads hat. So we had a nice little conversation about, always loved that logo, loved to see baseball back in Hickory, because Hickory has a long history of professional baseball dating back to the 19th century. And so it was really exciting to be able to be part of that. So the part I really want to mention is David was so gracious when I told him I was coming through town, that he arranged for my family and me to have dinner in, I don't know if they still have that wonderful restaurant over near the right field fence, but we had dinner that night. And then we had arranged for something special for my two sons, who were, that was 2003. So Gabe was 6 years old, and Lucas, our younger son, was 3. And the public address announcer asked if Gabe and Lucas Trevor could come to the clubhouse. And I had the honor of being able to walk both my sons out on the field so that the two of them could throw out the first pitch. And, or as my older son likes to say, he threw out the first pitch and his brother threw out the second pitch. But Gabe, who is the older and the more shy of the two, bounced it to the catcher, and Lucas had this little sly grin on his face when he had his chance to throw, and he hurled it all the way to the backstop. And by the way, it turned out Lucas ended up being the athlete in the family, and Gabe is more of the artistic type. It was a wonderful experience, and David is the one who made that happen. And my kids will never forget that. And our Christmas card that year was a picture of the two of them sitting on the lap of Conrad the Crawdad, having their after that happened at the game. So it's always been a very, very special part of our family's life and of their childhood that they still talk about 17 plus years later. So David, I appreciate it. And that's why when David asked if I do this, happy to do anything David would like me to do, particularly on behalf of folks in Hickory. But I do need to ask you one question, David, since you now work for WNNC. Do you still have Chopper 123?
No, they don't have Chopper 123.
For those of you who aren't familiar with
they
it,
barely have me, but yeah.
It was this great, because back in the 80s, all these TV stations had helicopters that would land at football games. And I guess it was a Volkswagen Beetle that they painted with the station's colors and put a fake propeller on top of it. And I always got a kick out of that. I always thought that was so cool. So, like I said, worked in Hickory for almost 2.5 years, had a really, really great experience there. It's a wonderful town, and I'm really happy to be able to talk to everyone here and to answer any questions any of y'all might have.
Let me finish. I want to tell everybody what Greg has gone on to do. So after I kept up with Greg after he came down, and I'd Google him every once in a while because every year with 9/11, he gets called to do a lot of things, and he can tell you some of that. But you Google Greg Trevor and 9/11, and you can read for days. He has been so generous with his time. He has written lots of articles and been a part of gatherings, and I just admire him so much. So I've kept up with him. He probably didn't know this, but I knew he was at Rutgers. He went to Rutgers after the Port Authority, and didn't know where he was after Rutgers, but I found him. He's moved on to University of Georgia, where he's the director of marketing and communications. So, but he's just an incredible person, and I'm going to turn it over to him. I've asked Jim Correll to give our sunshine after Greg speaks, so please hang on to that. Some of the old timers will remember Jim gave a presentation after 9/11. He has an interesting 9/11 story that you'll want to hear. It's a really good story. So with that, Greg,
thank you, David.
The floor is yours.
I appreciate that. First, it is important, and again, I appreciate that's very gracious introduction, and thank you. I do feel it's important as a survivor of the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001, that I do speak when asked to. And I'll tell you the most important reason. I did work for the Port Authority. I worked there for nearly 6 years, from 1998 to 2004, and I worked one of the areas that I was involved in public affairs was promoting the Port Authority Police Department. Port Authority has a police department that patrols all of the facilities owned and operated by the Port Authority, which included at that time the World Trade Center, but also included the airports, the PATH subway system, which connects New Jersey and New York, the bridges and tunnels that connect New Jersey and New York. And so it's at the time I was working there were probably about 1,000, 1,200 police officers and commanders. Now I think it's up to closer to 1,600 to 1,700. But one of the reasons I feel very strongly about this is because, there's been a lot of talk about people who have lost their lives, and 37 Port Authority police officers and commanders were killed that day, which is still to this day the single largest loss of life by a single police department on a single day in U.S. history. There were 23 NYPD officers who were killed, 343 FDNY firefighters who were killed. One of the reasons I feel very strongly about speaking on this topic is because I am very fortunate to be one of approximately 25,000 people who were successfully evacuated from the World Trade Center complex on the morning of September 11th. And that includes all sorts of stories of heroism, including people who stayed at their posts to help assist with the evacuation, both uniformed and civilian personnel. And as I get into my story, I'll tell you about some of the talk to one uniformed personnel at the Port Authority Police who I wouldn't be alive today without his heroism. But one of the reasons I feel very strongly about speaking about this is there is a common misunderstanding among many people, not everyone, but among many people, particularly people who do not live in the New York metropolitan area, that if you were in the World Trade Center on September 11th, you died. And in fact, yes, nearly 3,000 people lost their lives, including many dear friends of mine with the police department. I still have a photo. If you look behind my head to back here, you'll see a picture at the top of my bulletin board of a woman named Kathy Mazza, who was a Port Authority police captain who ran the Port Authority Police Training Academy, was a former operating room nurse, and created the first ever portable heart defibrillator program at a public transportation agency in the country. And that was a couple of years before September 11th that she did that. She was probably the person I knew the best who was killed that day. She and other people in the academy drove over from Jersey City into New York City and ran into the buildings. Her body was found 6 months later with several other Port Authority police commanders whom I knew, and they were carrying an overweight woman in an evacuation chair toward the exit. And based on the debris field where their bodies were found, they died 10 feet from the exit door. And it's one of those very, very difficult things to even think about today, about how closely they came to surviving, but how they sacrificed themselves to try to help someone who was in need. And I always refer to Kathy as my guardian angel. I've always kept her in my office since then. And I always think, whenever I'm thinking about what I should be doing with my life, I think about what kind of inspiration I can draw from her. She was an amazing person, and I still miss her to this day. And on Friday, I'll miss her even more. I don't go more than a few days without thinking about September 11th, particularly this time of year, particularly with weather like the kind we're having here. Sunny, temperatures in the mid 80s, not a cloud in the sky, which is exactly the way it was in New York City on the morning of September 11th. I always pray every year for rain because it just makes it easier to experience that. But I'm still in therapy. I still suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. I will tell you that PTSD has actually now led for me, and the stress that surrounds that. I've now been diagnosed as a result with type 2 diabetes, which is stress induced, or can be. And so, I still deal with the legacy of that day. So the morning of September 11th, 2001 began like many other days, except I was stupid enough to get to work early that day. I usually worked a 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. shift, but the previous day I had been part of a group that had gone to Kennedy Airport to give the New York Times editorial page a tour of the airport. And I had taken a Port Authority vehicle from the World Trade Center out to Queens to Kennedy Airport. And one of the rules was, if you had the vehicle after hours, you could bring it home as long as you returned it the next morning. So I brought the vehicle home. I lived in New Jersey at the time, got up very early in the morning to try to beat the traffic through the Holland Tunnel to get back into the city. So I was actually at my desk that morning at 7:15. What I remember more than anything else was just what a bright, sunny day it was. And I had gone into the office. I had done what every good bureaucrat does, which is I had replied to all of my voicemails and emails. So I had put everything back on, kind of hit the ball over the net into the court of the other people I was working with. So everybody I worked with knew I was there that morning. And I was in the process of working on a promotion for a new rail service to Newark Airport, which was supposed to start at the end of September. And I'd just gotten off the phone with one of my counterparts at Newark Airport when the first plane hit. And I was in Tower 1. My office was on the 68th floor of Tower 1. And I have a bad back. So after I got off the phone, I stood up to stretch my lower back. And when I felt the impact of the first plane, which was about 25 floors above me, it hit me to my left and knocked me to the floor. And then you could feel the tower sway. Now, for those of you I don't know if any of you have read anything about the World Trade Center, but when it was built in the 60s, one of the things it was built to do was to withstand an impact from a plane, which at that time, the largest plane was a 707. There had been an incident in 1945 in New York City on a very foggy day where a B-25 propeller plane had hit the Empire State Building. And so they were cognizant of the fact, the engineers who designed the towers, that you would need to be able to absorb the impact of a plane. So the towers were designed to sway up to 6 inches in any direction. My feeling based on that impact was that it moved probably somewhere between 10 and 20 feet. And then it swayed back and forth, almost like a car antenna a few times. And then I looked out my window and I saw a parabola arc of flame go by, and then this blizzard of paper and glass, and then nothing except for car alarms going off 68 stories below me on street level. At that point, I thought there had been an explosion. I was not thinking plane, because in 1993, on February 26th, a car bomb was exploded in the basement of the World Trade Center complex. And it was an attempt by the same group of terrorists to try to bring down the towers as a symbol of American capitalism, is what they indicated. So at first I thought that it had been a bomb. And I immediately get a call from my immediate supervisor, a gentleman by the name of Peter Yerkes, who was our deputy director of public affairs. He was on the ferry coming over from New Jersey to New York, and he called me and he said, "Don't be alarmed, but I think there's been some kind of an explosion and you're going to need to evacuate." And I said, "No, I agree with you." And so I went into my boss's office, a woman named Kayla Bergeron, who ironically now lives in the Atlanta area, about an hour from me, but she was our director. And we had a conversation about that we were going to need to evacuate. She got on the phone with our chief operating officer, a gentleman who's no longer with us by the name of Ernesto Butcher. He survived that day, but he has since passed. And I got on the phone with the Port Authority Police main office in Jersey City. One of the advantages of being in a bi-state agency, which the Port Authority is that if you have a problem in one state, you can evacuate to the other. So we relatively quickly made a determination that we were going to need to evacuate. So we gathered everybody on our floor, 68, and we started to move toward the stairwells. Now, the World Trade Center towers each had 3 stairwells, and we had mandatory evacuation drills at least twice a year. And part of the reason was in response to the 93 bombing, they wanted to make sure that everybody who worked for the Port Authority knew how to evacuate properly. And that meant we were all issued flashlights, we were all issued glow sticks. And if you couldn't make a mandatory evacuation training session, you had to have a damn good reason, because they took it very, very seriously. So the story that David refers to briefly was, as we were about to evacuate, we had 2 calls holding from media organizations. And Anna Abellians, who was one of our receptionists, was already there that day. And we were about to, the standard procedure was when the office was closed for the day or on weekends, we would forward the phones to the police department. So we were about to do that. And she said, "Well, there's 2 calls holding." I said, "Okay, you get one, I'll get the other. We'll get rid of them. We'll get the hell out of here." So I pick up the phone and I said, "Greg Trevor here." And the voice on the other line said, "Hi, I'm with NBC National News. If you could hold on for just 5 minutes, I want to put you on for a live interview." And I said, "No, I'm sorry, I can't. We're evacuating the building." He goes, "Well, this will only take a minute." And I said, "No, we're leaving right now." And then there was this pause. He kind of got flustered. He goes, "But this is NBC National News." And I remember thinking later, oh, well, okay, if it was like the local affiliate, I'm not going to risk my life, but because it's, Katie Couric and the National News, sure. And I don't mean to sound blithe about it, but it's one of those things that you deal with later and you think about. I will tell you, I didn't tell my wife that story until at least, I think it was more than a month after 9/11. And when I did, she started to cry and she goes, "You are such a good soldier that you probably on most days would have stayed. And can you imagine what would have happened if you had died? The last thing I would have of you is your voice talking to the Today Show." So I'm really glad I didn't. So we all moved to the stairwells. I made sure everybody in our section was in the stairwell before I got in. And that was probably right a little before 9 a.m. And the reason I know that is because the first plane hit at 8:46 a.m. The second plane hit at about 9:02 a.m. And we didn't feel it. We were already in the Tower 1 stairwell, so we did not feel the impact. We did know it had happened because one of my colleagues, a gentleman by the name of Pasquale DeFulco, who happened to be home that day because he was having window treatments put on his house, was watching CNN and sending us updates through our BlackBerry interactive pagers. So we knew about the second plane. We knew about the Pentagon. We didn't find out about Shanksville till later because that happened a little later. And, but we were just, because at first we were like, it was such a clear day. How could a plane have hit the towers? And I should point out that when I worked at the Port Authority, in those days before 9/11, that part of Lower Manhattan was considered a free fly zone, which meant if you didn't have to have like a flight plan. So there were hot air balloons, there were helicopters, there were tow banner planes, prop planes. There was aviation all around the building. And I remember the first time I saw something like that, it unnerved me. I'm like, why are there so many planes around here? And people are like, that's just how it works. And so we were very familiar with air traffic around the towers. So it made no sense until Pasquale explained that it was a terrorist attack. So again, we had our procedures. We knew what to do, which was we went down the stairwells 2 at a time, unless there was somebody running up, like a firefighter or a police officer, and then we move over to the side, let them go up and stay out of their way so they could go up and provide assistance. The way the evacuation worked is it took approximately a minute per floor to evacuate. So we were on the 68th floor. There were people in other departments of the agency. The executive offices were on 67. Aviation was on 65. So most of the people we were evacuating with were coworkers. I mean, a lot of people, we all know about the different financial firms and other people who had worked in the towers. Most of the people we were with were our coworkers. And for nearly an hour, excuse me, it was pretty orderly. I mean, we just walked down, we knew what we were supposed to do. And then we got down to about the 4th floor. That's when Tower 2 collapsed. And I should point out that when the Trade Center was designed, there was common infrastructure between Tower 1 and Tower 2, particularly HVAC, water delivery, that kind of thing. So when Tower 1 collapsed, the impact of that significantly affected what was happening when Tower 2 collapsed, significantly affected what was happening in Tower 1. So we got down to the 4th floor. It was 9:59 a.m. We found out later. And we're on the 4th floor, and all of a sudden, we feel this incredible rumbling. It felt to me like the floor of the entire Trade Center had just collapsed. It was actually Tower 2. So we felt this tremendous vibration. I was on the left side of the stairwell. I was thrown to the right. My back hit the banister. I looked up and all this dust fell into my face. The lights died. The emergency lights hadn't quite come on yet. And the stairwell filled with dirt and dust. And then this very odd thing happened, which is water started running down the stairs. Now, one of the interesting engineering feats of the World Trade Center was getting water pressure up to the upper floors. And the way they did that was the top 3 floors of the towers, with the exception of like the upper floor where the restaurant was, the top 3 floors were water tanks. So at night, they would pump water up to the top and then let gravity work to get the water down to the bathrooms and places like that. So when Tower 2 collapsed, all that water started rushing down. So it was about 4 inches thick on the stairs. The way I've described it is it felt like you were wading through a dark, dirty river at night in the middle of a forest fire. It got very hard to breathe. I'm wearing a knit tie today. Excuse me, I'm wearing a silk tie today. That day I was wearing a knit tie, cotton. So I was able to put it over my mouth and nose and breathe through it. Other people didn't have that luxury. They were trying to breathe through their jackets or through their shirts. I breathed through my tie. I remembered the Lamaze breathing techniques that my wife and I had gone through for childbirth to try to stay calm. I frankly use those techniques as well when I talk to the media, is because it's a great way to kind of relax a little bit before you speak. In fact, I did that before this. And then they told us, put your right hand on the shoulder of the person in front of you and start to walk down. So we got down about 1 more floor, and forgive me, I'm about to use a bad word, but I want to tell you exactly how it happened. The next thing we heard was someone said, "Oh shit, the door's blocked. The door's locked." He meant blocked. What happened was the vibration from Tower 2 collapsing had jammed the emergency exit door into the door frame, so they couldn't get it open. Now, the standard procedure when you cannot evacuate one of the 3 stairwells was to walk over to another stairwell. By the way, we later found out that our stairwell was the last one where people successfully evacuated from because of the other disruptions that took place. So we were down so low in the tower at that point that there were no offices. There were no passageways. It was all mechanical rooms. So what we would have to do then is we would have to turn around and start going back up the stairs to about the 14th, 15th floor, and then cross over and try to get to another stairwell. So you can imagine the situation. We're in the forest fire. We're now wading against the current of the river. We still don't have a lot of light. It's very dark, very hard. We're going up. Other people are coming down. We're starting to bump into each other. That was really the time when I thought we might not make it. And I remember thinking, I wonder what it would feel like to die, and whether there would be pain or how that would feel to just basically for your life to end. And then I closed my eyes and I made a mental picture of my family. My wife, Allison, our two sons, Gabe and Lucas. I remember, my wife has these beautiful brown eyes. Gabe had blue eyes. Lucas had, at that time, blonde hair and little ringlets because he was, not even 2. By the way, I should also point out, this was September 11th. September 12th was my older son's birthday. So he turned 5 the next day. So they were very little kids. And I remember making a mental image of the 3 of them and thinking their faces will keep me calm. And if I die, they will be the last thing I will be thinking about before I die, because that was very important. I said a little prayer. I said, Lord, please let me see my family again. All that mattered at that point was to just see my family. So we start to walk up. Forgive me, I'm sorry, my nose is itchy. I'm having a little allergy issue today. And so we're walking up, people are walking down, we're starting to see this panic. And then this is where David Lim, who was a Port Authority police officer at the time, just retired a lieutenant. He was a canine officer. His dog, Sirius, like the dog star, was the only police dog killed on September 11th. And I was always very proud of the fact that months later, when there was a procedure that when any uniformed personnel's body was found at the Trade Center, they would stop all of the recovery work and they would put an American flag over the body and they would take it out and everybody would stand at attention. When Sirius's body was found, the dog's body, they did the same thing, which I always thought was really one of the most moving aspects of the recovery that I can remember. So David had left his dog in the kennel in the basement of the Trade Center and had gone up to assist. He was later trapped for 5 hours after Tower 1 collapsed. But he was at the door when when the rescue workers finally got the door open. And it was David's quick thinking that I think saved a lot of lives, including mine. You have to ask yourself the question, how do you get people who are bumping into each other in the dark to turn around and head in the right direction? David started shouting at the top of his lungs, down is good, down is good. And I remember hearing it, and I remember looking over my shoulder and saying, down is good. And then it felt like an echo all the way up the stairwell. And then we turned around, and then we really just started moving. We got out of the stairwell. We got into the main, basically retail floor of the Trade Center. If you've ever seen the documentary shot by the 2 French filmmakers, where there's a scene of people running past these 2-story glass windows, that's how we got out. And by the time we got there to that point, we were walking single file to the exit. It was filled with dust. The way I've described it is it felt like we were in the middle of a dark, dirty snow globe that had just been shaken. So there was dust everywhere. I still was breathing through my tie. There was dust caked on all the windows. And we got outside finally. And this was about 10:18. And it's important because we got out about 11 minutes before Tower 1 collapsed. And in fact, the essay I wrote, the first sentence is, my life was spared by 11 minutes. So we get outside, and the thing I remember most is that we were told by the rescue workers to wait under an awning while the rescue worker would kind of step out and look up. And we had no idea why he was doing that, but that was at the point where people were starting to jump out of the upper levels of the towers to the ground, as opposed to waiting for the building to collapse. So he wanted to make sure that we were not going to have anybody land on us while we were going. And so he told us we could go. We walked around the perimeter of the World Trade Center Plaza. And then we went down what's known as the survivor staircase, which is the one piece after everything collapsed, the one part of the Trade Center complex that was above street level that actually survived. And that's the staircase that we used, and that staircase is still part of the it's part of the World Trade Center Museum. So then we get out onto street level and we start heading north. I mentioned before that Kayla Bergeron, my director, was with me, and she sends me a message on the BlackBerry saying, where should we go? And I walked over to her and said, Holland Tunnel. And she said, why? I go, that's a Port Authority facility. We'll be able to get into a police vehicle and get off the island. So we started walking up the street. There were TV crews there. They wanted to interview us. We said no. People were handing us water. We were covered in dust. And so it was very clear where we had come from. And we got maybe about a block. I turned around and looked over my shoulder, and there was so much smoke coming out of Tower 1. It was like the upper third looked like it was on fire. There was so much smoke, I couldn't even tell that Tower 2 had collapsed. That's how much smoke there was. And that's what most people who on TV saw. So we get about a block and a half north of the complex, and all of a sudden we feel this rumbling. And I look up and I see the face of a New York City police officer, and he says, run for your lives. And I got to tell you, when a New York City police officer tells you that, you listen. And we just started running. It was Tower 1 collapsing, and we were racing to get away from the debris and the dust and the smoke when that building pancaked down and it collapsed down to dust. And we just started running, and we ran for blocks until finally I always say we outraced the cloud. And when the cloud finally dissipated, we were about a block from the Holland Tunnel. So we'd run about 6 or 7 blocks. And there was a gentleman I used to work with named John Toth, who worked in the aviation department. He and I worked on a lot of projects together. And I saw John, and John was limping. His knee was bloody. I said, John, are you okay? And he said, they're gone, Greg. I thought he was talking about a person or people. I said, who? He goes, no. He said, the towers. And I looked back, and that was the first time I saw it. I always say it looks like there was this hole in the sky, because a few minutes earlier, an hour earlier, we were 700 feet up in our offices, and eventually got down in time to evacuate. And then after that, it was, I know we don't have a lot of time, and I do want to hear Jim's story, because I'm sure it's equally compelling. And there's so many stories of heroism and survival of that day. But we did get into a police vehicle, like 7 of us piled in the back seat. We drove to Jersey City, and we went back to work. And I wrote the first statement of the Port Authority on my BlackBerry. In fact, I have it here because I wrote it in my essay. I can tell you exactly. And this is the first statement that the agency issued, and I wrote it on a BlackBerry and sent it to the Associated Press. Our hearts and our prayers go out to the families of the countless people, including many members of the Port Authority family, who were killed today in this brutal and cowardly attack. All PA facilities, PA meaning Port Authority, facilities are closed until further notice. We at the PA are doing everything within our power to assist the families of the victims and to cooperate with federal, state, and local authorities to capture the perpetrators of this attack and bring them to justice. And for weeks after that, we were working 12 to 16-hour days. At first, 7 days a week, and then eventually they started letting us take 1 day off a week, working in Jersey City. And it was a surreal experience. The only other point I want to make, and then if anybody has any questions, I will be glad to answer them. I mentioned before that 25,000 people were successfully evacuated that day. And one of the reasons I feel very strongly about speaking about this is I mentioned friends of mine who gave their lives. If people think that nobody survived, if they thought that everybody who was in the towers died, then what that means is all of those men and women, all those courageous men and women who ran into the towers died in vain. And that just, it's too much pain for me to bear to think that people think that. I am alive today. 25,000 people are alive today because of their heroism. And when David asks why I'm always willing to speak about this, it's for that reason more than anything else, which is I want people to remember that people like Kathy Mazza, who's behind me, and Jimmy Ramito, who was one of our police chiefs, and Tony Infante, who was the police commander at Kennedy Airport, who all ran into towers and didn't make it out, that they did it so that people like me could survive and share my story with anyone who was willing to listen and never forget their heroism and the sacrifice that they made that day. So if anybody has any questions, please don't hesitate. As you might imagine, in 19 years, I've been asked virtually anything. So do not feel shy or ashamed to ask me any questions that you might want to ask.
If somebody will ask some questions, get you to go to about 10 till, and it's 12:40 now, so we got 10 minutes for questions.
Okay.
Well, Jim, you want to give your story, and then we'll leave the last 10 minutes for questions after that then.
Unmute. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. All I can say is wow. Unbelievable story, Greg, and thank you for sharing. Mine's going to be hopefully a little more upbeat from the standpoint that it had a positive ending as well as Greg's did. But on 9/11, Liz and I were over in Amsterdam, and we were on our way home. We made it to the airport in time, and we boarded the plane, and we took off, and the pilot said that weather in Philadelphia is excellent, and we should have a very pleasant ride. and then we were, I guess, about two hours out. The pilot came on and the PA and said, due to inclement weather on the East Coast, we are going to have an alternate landing site, which sounded a little strange, but okay. And so we did. We landed. We didn't know where we were landing. And as we landed, you could look on the tarmac and you could see the fence around the airport. And it looked like probably 100 to 150 people with binoculars and cameras and so forth. We made the turn on the tarmac, and we wound up being the 39th of 53 planes that landed in Halifax, Nova Scotia that day, not knowing where we were landing. Once we did stop the plane, the pilot came on and told us what had happened, that the United States had come under a terrorist attack, and they had destroyed the World Trade Center buildings, and they had hit the Pentagon. And at that time, we had heard they were headed toward the White House or the Capitol. Obviously, this was about 11:30 in the morning. And Liz, my wife, Liz, said she had the only cell phone on the plane that actually worked. So we called Verizon, and they told us to let anybody that's on that plane use it that day. One of the flight attendants happened to have a charger, so that worked out well. But remember, this was about 11:30 in the morning. We stayed on that plane until 11:30 that night. We could not get off the plane until they had arrangements for all of us. There were 1,500 of us that once we did get off about 11:30 that evening, and all we could take with us is what we brought in on the plane. No luggage, just what we carried on. And so we went to the airport, and they had us all grouped together by plane, and we wound up going to an abandoned hockey rink, an indoor hockey rink. There were 1,500 of us. Halifax did an excellent job. They provided us with air mattresses. They provided us with 3 hot meals a day. But needless to say, we were a little nervous with what all had transpired. Once we arrived at the hockey rink, we were able to see the TV, rebroadcast of what had happened and what had transpired, which made us that much more nervous. But the main thing I wanted to get across is the people of Halifax treated us with excellent care. They provided us, as I said, with 3 hot meals a day. They took us on tours of the city. They took us to Walmart to get clothes if we needed, any type of items that we needed. Now remember, this was Tuesday night when we landed there, and it wasn't until Friday morning of when they let us leave to come back to the United States. And we happened to be on a domestic airline. If we were not on a domestic airline, we would have to go back to whatever country that we originated from. So we did leave and a lot more security, needless to say, on that Friday morning to come to Philadelphia. And we made it. And as soon as we got off the plane, we knelt down and kissed the ground. So we were extremely thrilled to be back in the United States of America. So that was my brief story, which obviously was an experience to behold, something we'll never forget. But just, we were so glad to be back in the United States. So I'll answer any questions too, but I think Greg would have many more questions.
Thank you, Jim. That was good, interesting to hear.
Hey, Greg, I want you to share something about, I remember you talking about your legs and the color of your skin.
Oh yeah,
What it did to you. Go ahead.
absolutely, yes. When we got out, my legs were killing me from walking, and I like to walk, and so I was doing a lot of walking for exercise. But walking down those stairs and then running, and then the PT from experiencing it gave me a tremendous amount of pain in my legs, and then my skin and the skin of many of the people I was with turned very gray because of all that we had experienced. It took several days before the color really returned to my face, and it took even longer for my legs to feel normal again. So I want to make a point, because I think Jim made an excellent point about kissing the ground. The first thing I did when I got home that night, because my wife and I didn't speak until 2:30 that day, and she had thought several times that I had been killed when the planes hit, when the towers collapsed. When I finally got home on the train, because I took the train to work every day, which was close to midnight, the first thing we did was go to church. Our church happened to be St. Peter the Apostle Catholic Church, which was across the street from the train station. And we went in and just knelt down and prayed, and thank God for my safe delivery, and also prayed for the souls of all who had lost their lives that day. And at that point, we had no way of knowing how many people had survived. So Jim, and by the way, Jim, the people of Halifax are amazing. As someone who has part Canadian ancestry, I'm proud to hear that fellow Canadians were their usual Canadian selves in terms of helping people, but really went out of their way to be gracious and good hosts. And Halifax is a beautiful city. So I'm glad to hear that they treated you and everyone else with the kindness that you deserved.
Thanks.
Greg, can you hit the chat? I think a question popped up.
Oh, sure. All right, what is the one thing that sticks in your mind the most? It actually is from the aftermath. Very good question. It was the fact that I had to go back to work, and literally go back the next day, even though it was our son's birthday. I was supposed to have the day off, but I ended up going into work at 6 a.m. And the thing that sticks in my mind the most was when we would go back into that part of New Jersey, which is right across the river from New York. You could look through the window and still see the smoke rising from the towers, all the smoke and dust that was still rising up. And it felt like I was commuting into a war zone every day. And there were many people, as part of our business continuity plan, the Port Authority had reserved an entire hotel in Jersey City for people to stay. And I decided, and actually got special dispensation, to go home every night. Our older son, who was turning 5, had just begun kindergarten, and I wanted to be at the bus stop with him every day, so that he could feel a certain amount of, a normal part of his life. And this is, to David's point, I'm still like limping. My skin looked terrible, but I wanted them to feel like Dad was there and that Dad was helping, doing whatever he could to give them some semblance of a normal existence. So that, to me, is the thing that still to this day remains with me the most, was that desire to put family first in terms of everything that we were doing. And the town I was living in at the time, Highland Park, New Jersey, which is where we were living before I moved to Athens 4 years ago, people were wonderful. Many of the towns in that part of New Jersey lost people. Highland Park, for some reason, did not lose anybody. I was the only person who was in the towers that day, and I survived. So it was a little different, but our neighbors, our friends, were incredibly supportive of Allison and the boys as I had to go back in and work every day to cope with and begin to recover. I'm seeing more questions here. How did the stuck door get unblocked? They pulled it open. Several people just pulled on it and other people shoved it. It was just sheer human force to get that door open, to just push open through the frame. Have you been inside the new tower? I have not. I have not been able to bring myself to do that. It is still very painful. And I would like to be there eventually if I feel like I'm up for it, but it's still just too emotional an experience. At the same time, I have not been to the 9/11 museum at the Trade Center site. I just cannot bring myself to do that yet. The Oliver Stone movie, World Trade Center, which features actors portraying people I knew, like Will Jimeno, who was one of the police officers who was rescued. I did the pre-interviews with him before he talked to the media, and I can't bring myself to watch that either. I mean, it's still too immediate and too painful. So I hope at some point in my life, I'm 56 now, I hope at some point in my life I will be able to do that. But right now I still just do not feel ready to do that. Are there any other questions anybody have?
Well, Greg, thank you, brother.
Oh, my pleasure. Seriously, I'm happy to do it.
I wish I can't, to our group, I can't emphasize enough how much he has done every year. And I'm sure, how much have you got lined up this week? Do you have quite a few?
Actually, this is the only one, to tell you the truth. I'm a little surprised. I'm guessing next year with the 20th, I probably will be. Can I put in a plug for something for things we could do with September 11th going forward? This is the evangelical part of me. David pointed out I've done a lot of writing on the subject. One of the things I have written about is how will September 11th be remembered 50, 100 years from now? Let's face it, we don't do the best job in this country of marking important dates. We usually commercialize them or we forget about them. And it's painful to people, the survivors of Pearl Harbor, for example, or other important dates, that if people can't figure out a way to commercialize it, they tend to be forgotten. And I'm very worried personally about how September 11th will be remembered in 50 years. We've already seen people try to make money off it. It's disgusting, but it happens. And we've also already seen some waning sense of urgency about it. I wrote an essay that was in the Washington Post six years ago where I said, and I would love to, anybody who would like to talk about this going forward, I would love the proposal I made was that the presidents Bush, Obama, Trump have called on September 11th to be a national day of service. And I think that's wonderful, but not everyone can serve. And I have proposed that September 11th eventually become what I call a national day of discussion, where people do like what we have just done and talk about either the experiences of that day and my experience and Jim's experience. And it's important for me to hear that too. And I'm really glad you shared it. or to talk about other things that are important to a community. My last year in New Jersey, we did one about destigmatizing mental health care. We did a whole session in our town about those issues. And then last year in Athens, we did something more about kind of how people can, again, cope with stress and some other issues. Doesn't have to be about that, but that's just something that's very near to my heart, particularly as someone who's still in therapy every week. But I know that one of my old friends from the Charlotte Observer, Roberta Borden Wilson, who lives in Lincoln County, has talked about trying to set something up in Lincoln County where we would have a day of discussion. So if anybody's interested, David has my contact information, and I'd be happy to talk to anyone about doing something like that. Because to me, and this I think gets to Jim's point too, what was so special about that day was how the way everybody came together. You know, you always think of the headline in Le Monde, we are all Americans. And we were all, as virtually an entire world where people were together looking out for one another. And the way we can, I think the way we can keep that spirit alive is by doing exactly what we did today. And again, David, I'm so appreciative for you inviting me to come speak to this wonderful group of people from a town that I still hold very dear to my heart. So I wanted to thank that. So that's my evangelical plug. If anybody is interested in following up, I'm happy to have that conversation. Anything else that anybody would like to share? I know you guys have to wrap up in a minute, so.
Greg, this is Lou Wetmore, and I can only echo what Jim Carell said about your presentation. That is wow. That is extremely powerful, and I really appreciate your taking the time to share that with us, and hope that as time passes, you will be able to visit the museum. But I can certainly understand why it's so terribly difficult to do it now. Anyway, thank everyone else for participating today. Next week, our meeting will be by John Searby, who's the Executive Director of the Catawba River Keepers, and it'll be presented by Jack Hyatt. And our invocation will be by Lindsay Kiesler. I wish everyone a good week, what's left of it, and would appreciate it if the Rotarians would join me in reciting the four-way test as we close. Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it bring goodwill and better friendships? And will it be beneficial to all concerned? Thank you all again, and have a good week, what's left of it.
Thank you much. God bless all of you.